The funeral was over, the grave was filled. The town had moved on. But 14 days later, the dead man walked back into Redstone, Texas, with dust on his boots and blood under his fingernails. No one could explain it. No one wanted to try. Because if Cole Bridger hadn't been in that coffin they'd lowered into the ground, then someone else had. And in a town where secrets were buried deeper than bodies, that question was more dangerous than any gun. The earth remembers what men try to forget. The heat that July was biblical. It pressed down on Redstone like a hand over a mouth, silencing everything but the buzz of flies and the creak of wood expanding in the sun. The town sat at the edge of Comanche County, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to lean into one another for support, survivors of a promise that never quite delivered. Cole Bridger had been part of that landscape for 3 years. He wasn't the kind of man people knew well, but he was the kind they noticed. Tall, quiet, with eyes that looked past you rather than at you. He worked odd jobs, mostly at the lumber mill on the north edge of town, and kept a room above the hardware store. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't court the women who worked at the Silver Rose. He was polite in a distant sort of way, the kind of politeness that kept people from asking questions. The sheriff, a gray-haired man named Horace Greer, had always figured Cole for a man with a past. Most men out here were. Greer had been wearing a badge for 23 years, and he'd learned to tell the difference between a man running from the law and a man running from himself. Cole seemed like the latter. There was a sadness in him, worn smooth like a river stone, and Greer respected that sadness enough not to pry. The town respected it too, in its way. Redstone had its share of drifters and men with new names, but Cole wasn't trouble. He paid his debts, kept his word, and twice had stepped in when things got heated at the saloon, using his presence more than his fists to calm things down. He had that quality some men possess, a stillness that made violence seem unnecessary. There were rumors, of course, that he'd been a lawman once or a soldier, that he'd lost a family somewhere back east, that he'd killed a man in a duel and couldn't go home. But rumors were cheap currency in a frontier town, and no one traded them for fact. Then in late June, Cole started acting different. It was small things at first. He'd stand outside the hardware store in the evenings, watching the road that led south out of town, his hand resting on the porch rail like he was bracing himself against something unseen. He stopped taking meals at the boarding house and started buying canned goods, eating alone. He grew a beard, let his hair get long. He looked, Martha Sims said to her husband one night, like a man preparing for winter in the middle of summer. On the morning of July 9th, Cole didn't show up for work at the mill. The foreman, a thick-armed man named Dutch Carver, sent one of the younger hands to check on him. The boy came back 20 minutes later, pale and stammering. Cole Bridger was dead. He was lying on the floor of his room, still dressed, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. There was no sign of violence, no wound, no struggle. The doctor, an elderly man named Prout who'd seen more death than he cared to remember, examined the body and declared it heart failure. Said it happened sometimes with men who'd lived hard lives, men whose bodies just gave out when the strain became too much. The funeral was held 2 days later. It was a small affair. Cole had no family anyone knew of, no close friends. A dozen people stood in the July heat while Reverend Stokes said words over a plain pine coffin. Horace Greer was there, and Martha Sims, and Dutch Carver, a few others who'd known Cole in passing. They buried him in the town cemetery, on a hill overlooking the dry creek bed, under a simple wooden marker with his name and the year. And that should have been the end of it. But 3 days after the funeral, a rancher named Samuel Colfax rode into town with a strange story. He'd been checking fence lines on the western edge of his property, near the old stagecoach road, when he'd seen a man on foot, walking north. The man had been too far off to make out clearly, but there was something familiar in the way he moved, the set of his shoulders. Colfax swore it looked like Cole Bridger. Greer dismissed it. Grief played tricks on the mind, he said, and heat could make a man see things that weren't there. Colfax had been at the funeral, had seen the coffin lowered. It was natural for the mind to conjure ghosts. But then Lily Drummond, who ran the Silver Rose, mentioned that a drifter had come through 2 nights prior, asking questions about Cole. What kind of man he'd been, who his friends were, whether he'd left anything behind. The drifter had paid in silver, drank 1 whiskey, and left before midnight. Lily hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with Colfax's story making the rounds, it felt strange. Greer went to the hardware store and climbed the narrow stairs to Cole's room. The landlord, a nervous man named Pell, unlocked the door. The room was as it had been, untouched since the body was removed. A bed, a chair, a small table. Cole's few possessions were still there. A worn coat, a pair of boots, a leather satchel with a change of clothes. On the table sat the whiskey bottle, still half full, and beside it a small leather-bound journal. Greer picked up the journal. He'd never been one to invade a dead man's privacy, but something about the whole situation felt off, like a melody played in the wrong key. He opened the book. The pages were filled with names and dates, written in a careful hand. Places too. Towns in Kansas, Missouri, the Oklahoma Territory. Some of the names were crossed out. Others had notations beside them, short phrases that meant nothing to Greer. It looked like a ledger of some kind, a record of people. But why Cole Bridger, a quiet mill worker, would keep such a thing, Greer couldn't say. He pocketed the journal and left the room, locking the door behind him. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the street. The town was settling into its evening rhythm, but Greer felt unsettled, as though he'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. That night he sat in his office with the journal spread before him, trying to make sense of it. The names meant nothing to him, but the pattern was clear. Cole had been tracking people, hunting them, maybe, or hiding from them. Greer stared at the name. He didn't recognize it, but the fact that it was the last entry Cole had made felt significant. If someone named Jesse Carnahan had come to town just before Cole died, then maybe Cole's death wasn't as simple as heart failure. He decided to ask around in the morning. But when morning came, everything changed. The sun was barely over the horizon when Martha Sims came running down the main street, her skirts gathered in her hands, her face white as plaster. She nearly collided with Greer as he stepped out of his office, and it took her a moment to catch her breath enough to speak. "I saw him," Martha insisted. "Not an hour ago, out past the Kellerman place. I was collecting herbs by the creek and I saw him clear as day." Greer didn't waste time arguing. He saddled his horse and rode out with Martha pointing the way. They found the spot where she'd seen the figure, and sure enough, there were fresh tracks in the dust, boot prints leading north. Greer followed them for half a mile before he saw the man. He was standing in the middle of the road, motionless, facing the town, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Even from a distance, Greer knew the shape of him. It was Cole Bridger. Greer dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the revolver on his hip, though he didn't draw it. He approached on foot, his boots crunching in the gravel, and as he got closer, the man turned to face him. It was Cole's face, thinner than Greer remembered, gaunt and shadowed with exhaustion, but unmistakably his. The same dark eyes, the same line of his jaw. He looked like a man who'd walked through hell and come out the other side. "Cole." Greer's voice was barely a whisper. The man nodded slowly. "I know." Cole's voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. Cole looked past him, toward the town, his eyes distant. "A man who came looking for me." Cole nodded slowly. "For 3 years. Ever since he killed my brother in Missouri and took his name. Jesse's a ghost, Sheriff. He's been 6 men in 6 towns, leaving bodies behind when it suits him. He came here because he knew I'd found him." So what happened? Greer's hand hovered near his gun, not out of threat but out of instinct, the instinct of a man who sensed the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Cole took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to age him. He came to my room that night, the 9th, thought he'd poison my whiskey and make it look natural, but I'd been expecting him. We fought. He was good, but I was better. Then why didn't you come to me? Greer demanded. And that was when Cole Bridger said the thing that would unravel everything Horace Greer thought he understood about justice, about truth, about the choices a man makes when the past comes calling. Because there are others, Sheriff, others like him. The words hung in the air like smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, harsh and mocking. Greer stared at the man before him, a man who'd let his own funeral proceed, who'd watched from whatever hiding place he'd found, who'd allowed his name to be spoken over another man's body. What kind of desperation drove a man to do that? What kind of enemies? And as Greer opened his mouth to ask, to demand answers, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning air, fast and urgent, coming from the direction of town. Both men turned. 3 riders were approaching at a gallop, dust rising behind them like a storm, and even from a distance, Greer could see they were armed. They slowed as they spotted Cole and the sheriff, spreading out in a loose line, their hands resting on their weapons. Cole's face went very still. The riders stopped 20 yards away, and the man in the center, a lean figure with a black duster and a face like carved stone, smiled. It was not a kind smile. Cole said nothing, but his body was coiled tight, every muscle ready. The man's smile widened. "You come a long way to settle a debt. You took something from us in Missouri." The man's eyes flicked to him, cold and amused. "Your town's got a graveyard full of lies, Sheriff." Somewhere behind them, back in Redstone, a bell began to toll, though no one had rung it. The sound carried across the distance, mournful and insistent, like a warning no one knew how to read. The 3 riders never drew their weapons. Sheriff Greer would think about that for months afterward, how close they'd come to bloodshed without a single shot fired. Instead, the man in the black duster had studied Cole for a long moment, then tipped his hat, turned his horse, and ridden away with his companions, just like that, as if testing something, confirming a suspicion, then choosing to wait. "Who are they?" Greer had demanded. "Men who want me dead for reasons that won't matter if I tell you." And then Cole Bridger had done something that would haunt Redstone for the next 40 years. He'd walked away, not south toward Mexico, not north toward Kansas. He'd simply turned and walked west, into the empty country where the mesquite grew thick and the land belonged to no one, and he'd vanished. Greer had shouted after him, had even started to follow, but something in Cole's posture had stopped him. A finality. A man making a choice he'd already weighed and measured. So the sheriff had stood there in the dust, watching another ghost disappear into the Texas heat, and had known he'd just witnessed the beginning of something he couldn't stop. By nightfall, the whole town knew. Cole Bridger, dead and buried 2 weeks prior, had returned from the grave, and the man in the coffin wasn't him. The implications hit Redstone like a flash flood. Dr. Prout, whose examination had declared Cole dead of heart failure, found himself standing in his parlor explaining to a room full of angry citizens how he could have made such a mistake. The body had been the right height, the right build. The face had been badly bruised from what they now understood was a fight. In the July heat, with limited time and no reason to suspect foul play, he'd made his assessment and signed the papers. "I'm a doctor, not a detective," he'd said, his hands shaking. The undertaker, a skeletal man named Weiss, had prepared the body. He'd dressed it in Cole's clothes, clothes provided by the landlord Pell. He'd built the coffin and arranged the viewing, but there'd been no viewing, really. The Reverend had suggested a closed casket due to the heat and the condition of the deceased, and no one had objected. Why would they? No one had expected deception. But now, looking back, It all seemed impossibly careless. A man had been buried under false pretenses. The wrong name had been carved into the marker, the wrong prayers had been said, and somewhere under the Texas soil lay a murderer named Jesse Carnahan, resting in peace under a borrowed identity while the real Cole Bridger walked free. Or did he? That question consumed Horace Greer for weeks. He'd exhumed the body 3 days after Cole's reappearance, over the protests of Reverend Stokes and half the town council. The coffin came up from the dry earth still sealed, still intact. When they opened it, the smell was terrible, but the body was there, decomposing in the summer heat. Dr. Prout confirmed it was not Cole Bridger, though he couldn't say who it was. The face was too deteriorated, and there were no distinguishing marks he could identify with certainty. They buried the unknown man again, this time without ceremony, in the far corner of the cemetery where drifters and the unnamed were laid to rest. The wooden marker that had read Cole Bridger was burned. The town tried to move forward, but the questions lingered like smoke. Who had Jesse Carnahan been? Why had he wanted to kill Cole? And who were the 3 riders who'd come looking for answers? Greer sent telegrams to sheriffs in Kansas, Missouri, and the Oklahoma Territory, asking about men matching the riders' descriptions, asking about Jesse Carnahan, asking about Cole Bridger. Most went unanswered. The few responses he received were vague. One sheriff in Missouri mentioned a murder 3 years back, a man named Daniel Bridger killed in a land dispute, but he had no record of anyone named Cole investigating it. Another lawman in Kansas said the name Jesse Carnahan had come up in connection with a series of confidence schemes, but there'd never been enough evidence for an arrest. The pattern that emerged was frustrating in its incompleteness. Men with similar descriptions moving through frontier towns, taking on new names, leaving behind confusion and sometimes bodies, but nothing concrete, nothing that would help Greer find Cole or understand what he'd been running from. The town wanted answers. At first, there were meetings, loud gatherings at the saloon and the church where people demanded action. Martha Sims insisted Cole was an innocent man being hunted by criminals. Dutch Carver argued he was a fugitive who'd brought trouble to Redstone and should be tracked down. The council voted to post a $500 reward for information leading to Cole's whereabouts, not for arrest, but for questioning. No one claimed it. The first reported sighting came in August. A cattle driver passing through said he'd seen a man matching Cole's description working a ranch near the Brazos River, 30 miles west. Greer rode out with a deputy, but the ranch foreman said they'd had no new hands in months. The cattle driver, when pressed, admitted he'd only glimpsed the man from a distance and couldn't be certain. In September, a widow named Eleanor Chase swore she'd sold supplies to Cole at her trading post on the edge of the hill country. She described him perfectly, the height, the eyes, the quiet way of speaking, but when Greer arrived, she showed him the ledger where the man had signed for his purchases. The signature read John Smith, and the handwriting looked nothing like the careful script in Cole's journal. October brought more stories. A buffalo hunter claimed Cole was living with a group of hunters near the Canadian River. A missionary said he'd seen him at a remote mission helping to build a chapel. A prospector swore he'd shared a campfire with Cole in the Davis Mountains, where Cole had spoken of heading to California. Each lead pulled Greer or his deputies farther from Redstone, deeper into wild country, and each ended in nothing. False identification, mistaken memory, sometimes outright lies told by people who wanted the reward money or simply wanted to feel important. The frontier was full of tall men with dark eyes and quiet ways. Every one of them, it seemed, could be mistaken for Cole Bridger if the light was right and the viewer wanted it badly enough. By winter, the searches had slowed. The reward money sat unclaimed in the town safe. The deputy who'd ridden with Greer most often, a young man named Tom Ridley, had taken to calling the case the ghost hunt. and not without bitterness. He'd spent weeks in the saddle chasing shadows, neglecting his other duties, and had nothing to show for it. Maybe, Greer allowed, but he didn't believe it. Something in the way Cole had walked away that morning, the certainty in his movements, suggested a man with a plan, a man who knew how to disappear. The journal became Greer's obsession. He spent hours studying the names and dates, trying to piece together the story they told. He sent letters to lawmen in every town mentioned, asking about the crossed-out names. A few responses trickled back. One name had belonged to a man killed in a stagecoach robbery in Kansas. Another had died in a mining accident in Colorado. A third was serving time in a Missouri prison for fraud. The pattern suggested Cole had been hunting men involved in his brother's death, tracking them across the frontier, methodically removing them from the world. But the entries stopped making sense after 1884. The names became more scattered, the locations more random. It was as if Cole himself had started losing the thread of his pursuit, or had realized the futility of it. Revenge was a difficult thing to sustain over years, across hundreds of miles, when the men you sought were as transient as clouds. By the spring of 1887, nearly a year after Cole's disappearance, Redstone had changed. The story of the man who'd risen from his grave had become something people didn't talk about much anymore, at least not openly. It had the quality of an embarrassment, a collective mistake the town wanted to forget. Dr. Prout had moved away, unable to bear the whispers about his competence. The landlord Pell had sold the hardware store and left for California. Even Reverend Stokes, who'd presided over the false funeral, seemed diminished, his sermons less certain. But there were some who wouldn't let it rest. Martha Sims continued to insist Cole had been a good man wrongly pursued. She kept a candle burning in her window every night, she said, so that if Cole ever came back, he'd know he had at least one friend in Redstone. Her husband thought it was foolishness, but he didn't stop her. Dutch Carver, on the other hand, had become convinced Cole was a dangerous criminal. He'd started his own investigation of sorts, writing letters to law offices and newspaper editors, trying to find some record of Cole's past. He received few replies, and those he did get only deepened the mystery. No one seemed to have any official record of a Cole Bridger before he'd arrived in Redstone. No birth certificate, no land deeds, no military service. It was as if he'd simply appeared fully formed in 1883. The legend grew in the telling, as legends do. By 1888, stories about Cole Bridger were being told in saloons across 3 territories. Some said he was a gunfighter who'd killed 20 men. Others claimed he was a former Pinkerton detective gone rogue. A few insisted he'd discovered gold in the mountains and was living like a king somewhere in Colorado. Each version was more dramatic than the last, shaped by the teller's imagination and the audience's appetite for myth. The 3 writers who'd confronted Cole became part of the legend, too. They were described as everything from outlaw gang to government agents to avenging angels. Someone started calling them the Trinity, and the name stuck. Stories circulated about towns they'd visited, men they'd questioned, violence they'd left in their wake. Most of it was probably exaggeration, but Greer had learned that legends often contained seeds of truth, however buried. In 1889, a traveling journalist came through Redstone researching a book about frontier mysteries. He interviewed Greer at length, took notes on everything, examined the journal. His book was published the following year, titled Shadows of the Western Frontier, and it included a chapter on Cole Bridger. The journalist had embellished considerably, adding romantic flourishes and dramatic confrontations that never happened, but the basic facts were there. A man who'd faked his death, buried his enemy in his place, and vanished into legend. The book brought renewed attention to Redstone, and for a few months in 1890, the town was visited by curiosity seekers and amateur investigators. They walked through the cemetery, stood outside the old hardware store, asked questions of anyone who'd known Cole. Most townspeople were tired of the story by then and gave short answers, but Martha Sims would talk to anyone who'd listen, describing Cole as a gentle soul driven to desperate measures. And Dutch Carver would offer the opposite view, painting Cole as a cunning manipulator who'd fooled them all. The truth, Greer suspected, lay somewhere between. As the century turned and the old frontier gave way to something more settled, the story of Cole Bridger faded into the category of local legend. Greer retired in 1902, his hair white, his hands no longer steady. He'd never found Cole. He'd never learned the full truth. The journal remained in his possession, kept in a locked drawer, a reminder of the case that had defined his final years as sheriff. He died in 1912, and the journal passed to his daughter, who kept it without really understanding its significance. When she died, it went to her son, and then to his children. The leather binding grew brittle, the pages yellowed, the careful handwriting faded but remained legible. Redstone itself changed with the decades. The lumber mill closed. The Silver Rose burned down and was never rebuilt. The town that had once been a rough collection of weathered buildings on the edge of Comanche County became a quiet place with paved streets and electric lights. The old cemetery was maintained by a historical society, and Cole Bridger's story became one of many footnotes in the town's past, mentioned in tourist brochures alongside other colorful tales of frontier life. But there were always people who remembered. Old-timers who'd heard the story from their grandparents, historians who found it curious, writers who saw the dramatic potential. The name Cole Bridger never entirely disappeared, though each generation understood it a little differently. In 1963, a graduate student named Robert Marsh came to Redstone researching his thesis on frontier justice. He interviewed the few remaining residents who had any family connection to the original story. One of them was Martha Sims' great-granddaughter, an elderly woman named Claire, who told him about the candle in the window and her great-grandmother's absolute conviction that Cole had been innocent. She never stopped believing he'd come back, Claire said. Marsh included the story in his thesis, which was published as a book in 1966. It brought another small wave of interest, but by then the trail was so cold it was Arctic. The journal remained. It came to light in 2008, during an estate sale in Oklahoma. The great-great-grandson of Sheriff Greer had passed away, and his possessions were being liquidated. Among boxes of old photographs and papers, a dealer found the leather-bound book filled with names and dates. He recognized it as potentially historical and contacted a museum in Texas that specialized in frontier artifacts. The museum acquired it and spent months researching its contents. They confirmed it had belonged to Cole Bridger through handwriting analysis, comparing it to the few documents that still existed from the original investigation. They traced many of the names in the journal to actual people, constructing a network of connections that spanned half the frontier. And then, on page 73, carefully written in the margin of an entry dated June 1886, they found something that had been missed by everyone who'd examined the journal before. San Felipe, a town in New Mexico territory that had become a city by the 20th century, grown and modernized beyond recognition. But the entry was specific enough, dated enough, that it warranted investigation. The museum contacted historians in San Felipe. They searched through old census records, property deeds, and newspaper archives. And in the 1900 census, they found him, Thomas Gray, listed as a resident of San Felipe, age 38, occupation, schoolteacher, born in Missouri, no family, living in a boarding house on 4th Street. The age was right. The birthplace matched what little was known about Cole Bridger. And when they found a photograph in the San Felipe Historical Society's collection, A class portrait from 1903 showing the town's schoolteachers. They saw him. Third from the left in the back row. A tall man with graying hair and tired eyes, wearing a dark suit and standing slightly apart from his colleagues. The face was older, weathered by 17 years and whatever those years had contained, but the museum's director, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kincaid, felt certain it was him. She stood in her office, the photograph on her desk beside the journal, and felt the past reach across more than a century to touch her shoulder. Cole Bridger had survived. He'd made it to San Felipe. He'd become someone else, lived a different life, taught children their letters and numbers. And he'd done it quietly enough that no one had ever connected Thomas Gray to the man who'd vanished from Redstone in 1886. Dr. Kincaid began making calls. Within a week she'd assembled a team, a genealogist, a forensic historian, and a local researcher in San Felipe. They were going to find out what had happened to Thomas Gray, where he'd lived, how long he'd survived, whether he'd ever told anyone the truth about who he'd been. The search was beginning again, not for a fugitive or a ghost, but for the end of a story that had waited 122 years to be finished. And somewhere in an archive in San Felipe, in a box of uncatalogued papers from a boarding house demolished in 1954, a letter waited to be found. A letter addressed to no one, dated April 1914, written in a shaking hand by a man who knew he was dying and wanted, finally, to be honest. The letter was 8 pages long, written on both sides of cheap paper that had yellowed to the color of weak tea. Dr. Sarah Kincaid held it with cotton gloves in the climate-controlled room of the San Felipe Historical Society, reading by lamplight, though it was 3 in the afternoon. Outside, the New Mexico sun beat down on a city that would have been unrecognizable to the man who'd written these words, but inside this room, time moved differently. "My name is not Thomas Gray," the letter began. "It was once Cole Bridger, and before that it was something else entirely. I have lived under so many names that sometimes I forget which one my mother gave me." The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, the words chosen with care. Kincaid could feel the weight of them, the way each sentence had been considered before the pen touched paper. This was not a confession extracted under duress. This was a man trying, finally, to be understood. "I was born in Missouri in 1851. My father was a farmer, my mother a teacher." The letter detailed a childhood that sounded unremarkable. School lessons, farm work, Sunday services. But in 1868, his father had died, and the family had sold the farm. His older brother Daniel had stayed in Missouri to work in a lumber business. His younger brother had gone west to seek his fortune. The sister had married and moved to Illinois. And Cole had drifted, taking work where he could find it, never quite settling. I was 23 when I learned that Daniel had been murdered. The letter took 3 months to reach me. The authorities had called it a business dispute. Daniel had been in partnership with a man who disappeared along with the company's funds. When Daniel had tracked him down, there'd been a confrontation. Daniel had been shot. The killer had vanished before anyone could identify him properly. But Daniel's widow had given Cole a name, Jesse Carnahan. And she'd given him something else, too. A list of other men Jesse had swindled, other towns where he'd left debts and anger. Jesse was a man who moved through the world like water through fingers, taking what he wanted and leaving nothing behind but confusion. "I should have let the law handle it," the letter continued. "I should have gone home and grieved like a proper brother." And so Cole had begun hunting Jesse Carnahan. It took him 3 years. He followed leads across Kansas, through the Oklahoma Territory, down into Texas. He worked odd jobs to pay for his travel, saved every dollar he could. He learned to be invisible, to ask questions without seeming curious, to recognize the signs of a man who'd recently changed his name. Jesse was good at disappearing, but he wasn't perfect. He had patterns, habits. He liked to work in lumber or mining towns where there was money moving and poor record-keeping. He'd establish himself for 6 months, a year, ingratiating himself with the owners. Then he'd find a way to skim funds or steal outright, and he'd vanish before anyone realized what had happened. Cole tracked him to Redstone in June of 1886, but Jesse had known he was coming. He'd heard somehow, through whatever network of criminals and informants existed in the frontier's shadows, that Daniel Bridger's brother was asking questions. And Jesse had decided to end the pursuit permanently. He came to my room on the night of July 9th with a bottle of poisoned whiskey and a story about wanting to make amends. I had been expecting him for 3 days. I did not touch the whiskey. When he realized his plan had failed, he tried to shoot me. We fought. I was stronger than he expected. The problem, Cole explained in the letter, was that Jesse had not been working alone. He was part of a group, 5 or 6 men who moved through the frontier running confident schemes and worse. They protected each other, covered each other's tracks, and they had a reputation for being ruthless with anyone who interfered with their operations. I knew that if I went to the sheriff and told the truth, Jesse's partners would hear about it within weeks. They would come to Redstone. They would want revenge. And I had seen what they did to men who crossed them. There had been a newspaper editor in Kansas who'd written about their activities. So Cole had made a terrible calculation. He dressed Jesse's body in his own clothes, arranged it to look like natural death, and let Dr. Prout make his examination. He'd hidden in the crawlspace beneath his room while they carried the body away. He'd watched through a crack in the floorboards as his landlord had sorted through his belongings. And then, on the day of the funeral, he'd slipped out of town before dawn and watched from a distant hill as they buried Jesse Carnahan under his name. I thought if they believed I was dead, they would move on. I thought the pursuit would end. But I underestimated their persistence. 3 of them came to Redstone 2 weeks later. They had heard rumors that something was wrong, that the dead man might not be who people thought. The letter described months of running. Cole had moved west into empty country, sleeping in caves and abandoned line shacks, avoiding towns. He'd grown thin, half-wild. He'd nearly died of fever in the hill country, saved only by a Comanche woman who'd found him delirious and given him water and herbs. He'd worked as a ranch hand under false names, never staying more than a few weeks. He'd ridden through winter storms and summer droughts, always moving, always watching his back trail. By spring of 1887, he'd made it to New Mexico territory. And there, in a moment of desperate exhaustion, he'd done something that surprised even himself. He'd stopped running. I had reached San Felipe in late April. I was 29 years old and felt 50. I had perhaps $8 to my name. I was sleeping in a stable when the schoolmaster found me. He was an old man named Horace Wade, and he needed someone to help repair the schoolhouse before the spring term began. Working on the schoolhouse, Cole had discovered something he'd forgotten during his years of hunting and running. He was good with his hands, good at building and fixing things. And he was good with the children who came to watch him work, curious about the quiet stranger. He'd answer their questions, show them how to measure boards, let them help hold nails. When the repairs were finished, Horace Wade had made him an offer. The school needed an assistant teacher, someone to help with the younger children while Wade handled the older students. The pay was modest but steady. There was a room in the boarding house on 4th Street that was available. I should have said no. I should have kept moving. So Thomas Gray was born. Cole had chosen the name carefully. Common enough to be unremarkable, different enough from his real name that it wouldn't trigger recognition. He'd told people he'd come from Missouri, which was true, and that he'd lost his family, which was also true in its way. No one had pressed for details. San Felipe was growing quickly in those years, full of newcomers seeking fresh starts. He'd taught at the school for 27 years. The letter described a quiet life, almost aggressively ordinary. He taught reading and arithmetic to generations of children. He'd attended church services on Sundays, not because he felt especially religious, but because it was what schoolteachers did. He'd taken his meals at the boarding house, saved a small amount of money, bought a few books. He'd made no close friends, but he'd been friendly with many people. He'd been, in every way that mattered, invisible. "I think about Redstone sometimes," the letter said. "I wonder if Sheriff Greer ever found answers to his questions. I wonder if the people there still speak of the man who returned from his grave. I wonder if they think of me as a victim or a villain." The letter went on to describe his illness, a cancer that had started in his stomach and spread. The doctor had been honest about his prognosis. Thomas Gray, schoolteacher, would be dead by summer. "I am writing this not as a justification but as a record. I do not expect forgiveness. I deceived many people. I allowed a man to be buried under my name, which troubled me more than I can say." But he wanted it known, he wrote, that Jesse Carnahan had been a killer and a thief, that the body in the grave in Redstone was not an innocent man wrongly buried, that the 3 riders who'd come looking for coal had been part of a criminal network that had hurt many people, and that his flight had not been cowardice but a calculated attempt to draw them away from a town that had shown him kindness. Did it work? I do not know. I never heard of them coming back to Redstone. Perhaps they lost my trail in the empty country. Perhaps they decided I was not worth the effort. Or perhaps they found other enemies, other pursuits. The frontier is full of men with grudges and long memories. The final pages of the letter were more reflective, almost philosophical. Thomas Gray wrote about teaching, about watching children grow up and leave San Felipe for other lives. He wrote about the satisfaction of small accomplishments, a student learning to read, a roof successfully repaired, a garden planted behind the boarding house that had produced tomatoes and squash for 15 summers. "I think often of my brother Daniel. I wonder if I honored his memory by hunting his killer, or if I dishonored it by becoming obsessed with revenge. I wonder what he would think of the man I became after he died, the years I spent tracking Jesse, the years I spent hiding. To Sheriff Greer, if he still lives, I apologize for the trouble I caused. He was a good man trying to do his job, and I made that job impossible. To the people of Redstone, I apologize for the deception and the fear. You deserved better than the confusion I left behind. And to anyone who reads this letter and wonders whether justice was served, I can only say this. Jesse Carnahan died for his crimes. I lived with mine. Dr. Kincaid set down the letter and removed her gloves. Her hands were shaking slightly. She had read thousands of historical documents in her career, but few had affected her like this. The quiet honesty of it, the lack of self-pity, the clear-eyed acknowledgement of both crime and circumstance. It felt deeply human in a way that transcended the century between its writing and her reading. She spent the next 3 months verifying everything in the letter. The genealogist confirmed Daniel Bridger's murder in Missouri and the disappearance of his business partner. Newspaper archives contained scattered references to a confidence man named Jesse Carnahan, wanted for fraud in Kansas and suspected in several other cases. Census records confirmed Thomas Gray's presence in San Felipe from 1890 through 1914. And in the San Felipe cemetery they found his grave, a simple marker that read Thomas Gray, 1851-1914, beloved teacher. It was well maintained, with flowers that appeared to be regularly replaced. Kincaid tracked down who'd been paying for the upkeep and discovered it was the great-granddaughter of one of Gray's former students, a woman who'd heard stories about the kind teacher who'd helped her great-grandfather learn to read. In October of 2009, Dr. Kincaid published her findings in a historical journal. The article was picked up by several newspapers and a few history websites. For a brief time, the story of Cole Bridger and Thomas Gray circulated again, this time with its ending finally known. The reaction was mixed. Some people felt Cole had been justified in everything he'd done, that he'd been a victim forced into impossible choices. Others argued he'd obstructed justice and should have trusted the law to handle Jesse Carnahan. Still others simply found the story sad. A man who'd lost 28 years of his real life to fear and secrecy. Kincaid received letters from descendants of people who'd known Cole in Redstone or Thomas Gray in San Felipe. One came from Claire Sims Weatherby, the great-granddaughter of Martha Sims, who wrote, "My great-grandmother always believed Cole was innocent. I'm glad to know she was right." Another came from a descendant of Dutch Carver, who wrote, "My great-grandfather spent years insisting Cole was a criminal. He was half right, I suppose, but I think he would have been surprised to know Cole became a schoolteacher." And one came from the great-great-grandson of Sheriff Horace Greer, who included a photograph. The old sheriff in his final years, sitting on a porch with the journal in his lap. The letter said, "He never stopped wondering." The town of Redstone held a small ceremony in 2010. They erected a new historical marker at the cemetery, next to the grave of the unknown man who'd been briefly mistaken for Cole. The marker told the true story as far as it could be verified, that the grave held Jesse Carnahan, a criminal killed in self-defense by Cole Bridger, and that Bridger had lived out his life in New Mexico under an assumed name, teaching children for nearly 3 decades. Dr. Kincaid attended the ceremony. So did about 50 residents of Redstone, and a delegation from San Felipe that included the mayor and 3 teachers from what was now San Felipe Elementary School. They planted a tree between the 2 graves, Cole's false grave and Jesse's unmarked one, and the San Felipe teachers read aloud from letters that Thomas Gray's former students had written about him after his death. Letters describing patience, kindness, a man who'd made learning feel like discovery rather than duty. "He taught my father to read," one letter said, dated 1915. "My father was nearly grown and ashamed that he'd never learned his letters, Mr. Gray stayed after school every day for 6 months to help him, never made him feel stupid, never lost patience. Because of Mr. Gray, my father could read me stories when I was small." Standing in the Texas heat, listening to words written a century ago about a man who'd lived under a false name, Kincaid felt the story finally coming to rest, not with perfect justice, because there was no such thing. Not with complete understanding, because the human heart was always partly mystery, but with closure, the kind that comes when truth is finally spoken and received. The ceremony ended. People drifted back to their cars and their lives. The new marker stood in the afternoon light, bronze letters on granite, telling a story that was complicated and human and real. Dr. Kincaid stayed a while longer, sitting in the shade of the new tree, still small, still fragile but growing. She thought about Cole Bridger walking away from this town in 1886, choosing exile over endangering others. She thought about Thomas Gray teaching children their letters in a schoolhouse in New Mexico, building a quiet life from the ruins of his real one. She thought about Sheriff Greer spending years searching for answers he'd never find, at least not in his lifetime. The past was never truly past, she thought. It lived in letters and journals, in stories passed down, in the careful work of people who believed that truth mattered even when it came too late to change anything. Cole Bridger had died as Thomas Gray in 1914, unmourned by anyone who knew his real name. But now, 96 years later, he could finally be understood, not forgiven or condemned, but understood. She stood eventually and walked back to her car. Behind her, the cemetery stretched across the hillside, full of stories that would never be fully known, mysteries that the earth kept to itself. The sun was lowering in the west, casting long shadows across the markers, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called out, its voice carrying across the emptiness. In that moment, standing between past and present, between Redstone and San Felipe, between the man Cole had been and the man he'd become, Doctor. Kincaid felt what historians sometimes feel when a search finally ends. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing that someone who'd been lost was found. That someone who'd wanted to be understood finally was. The frontier had kept Cole Bridger's secret for more than a century. But in the end, the frontier gave it back. Not with fanfare or drama, but in the way truth usually comes. Slowly, quietly, in fragments gathered over time, in the patient work of people who care enough to keep looking. She drove away as the sun touched the horizon, and the last light fell across Redstone like a blessing, or a farewell, or perhaps both at once.